I want to begin, as I often do, by diffusing my own title because the phrase, the coming decade will ruin most people, is exactly the kind of phrase that arrives dressed as prophecy, and prophecy is precisely the register I want to avoid because it is both intellectually dishonest and practically useless. So let me be careful about the two errors that this framing invites, and let me foreclose both of them before I go any further. The first error is the one the phrase seems to promise, the error of doom, the prediction of imminent catastrophe, the sense that the world is ending and that ruin is coming for everyone in some dramatic and total way. That is not what I believe, and it is not what I am going to argue, and if you are here for a prophecy of collapse, you will be disappointed. And the second error is the opposite one, the comfortable dismissal, the assumption that everything will be fine because everything has always been fine, that the anxieties of every era turn out to be overblown, and that the intelligent posture is simply to relax and trust that the future will resemble the past. This error is subtler and I think more dangerous because it feels like wisdom, like the calm perspective of someone who has seen predictions of doom come and go, when it is in fact a specific failure to distinguish the periods in which the future does resemble the past from the periods in which it genuinely does not. The truth I want to develop sits between these, and it is more precise and more useful than either, and it is this. The coming decade is very likely to be a period of unusually rapid change, technological and monetary and structural, and rapid change is precisely the condition under which a specific kind of position breaks and a specific other kind of position thrives. When I say the decade will ruin most people, I do not mean that catastrophe will befall everyone. I mean something narrower and more structural, which is that most people have arranged their lives in a way that is fragile, optimized for a stability that is ending, dependent on conditions that are about to change, and that this fragility, invisible and even advantageous during the long period of relative stability we have lived through, becomes ruinous precisely when the stability ends. And when I say here is who survives, I do not mean the wealthiest or the smartest or the most talented. I mean something specific and I think deeply important, which is that survival through a period of rapid change is determined not by the magnitude of your resources, but by the structure of your position, by whether you have arranged your life to be fragile or to be resilient in the face of change itself. That is the distinction I want to develop carefully because I believe it is the single most important thing to understand about the decade ahead. Let me begin with the concept of ruin itself, because it is the thing that everything else orbits, and it is a concept that is genuinely underappreciated, particularly by people who have lived through a long stretch of stability. Ruin has a specific and terrible property that distinguishes it from ordinary loss, and the property is this. Ruin is absorbing. It is the state from which you cannot return. An ordinary loss, however painful, leaves you in the game, able to recover, able to try again, able to compound your way back from the setback. Ruin ends the game. It is the loss that is so complete, so structurally final, that recovery is no longer possible because the very capacity to recover has been destroyed. And this asymmetry between losses you can recover from and the ruin you cannot changes everything about how a rational person should think in a period of volatility. Because in a stable environment where volatility is low and ruinous events are rare, you can afford to optimize for gains, to take the risks that maximize your upside, because the probability of a truly ruinous event is small enough to ignore. But in a volatile environment where change is rapid and shocks are frequent and the range of possible outcomes is wide, the first priority is no longer maximizing gains. The first priority becomes avoiding ruin, because a single ruinous event erases everything you have accumulated and ends your ability to continue, and no amount of gains in the good scenarios compensates for ruin in the bad one, because ruin is not a large loss that averages against the gains. It is the end of the averaging altogether. And here is the problem, stated plainly. Most people having lived through a long period of relative stability, have forgotten about ruin. They have been rewarded for years for optimizing toward gains and ignoring the small probability of catastrophic loss. Because in the stable environment, the catastrophic loss rarely arrived, and the people who ignored it did better than the people who guarded against it, who looked overcautious and inefficient by comparison. The stable environment trains people to be fragile because fragility is efficient and rewarded when the environment is calm, and it punishes the resilient because resilience looks like wasted resources when no shock arrives to justify it. And so after a long period of stability, the population is optimized for stability, fragile, efficient, exposed, having forgotten the very possibility of the ruin that stability had made rare. And the coming decade, if it is what I believe it will be, a period of rapid change and elevated volatility, is precisely the environment in which that accumulated fragility becomes fatal, in which the positions optimize for the stability that is ending break under the change that is arriving. So let me describe the profile of fragility, the structure of the position that gets ruined, because it is worth being concrete about what fragility actually looks like, and because it very often does not look like weakness. The fragile position is one of total dependence on a single thing. A single employer providing all of one's income, a single skill on which one's entire economic value rests, a single income stream with no alternative if it stops, a single currency in which all of one's wealth is denominated, a single country, single system, single set of conditions on which everything depends and against which there is no hedge. The fragile position has no slack, no reserves, no optionality, no capacity to absorb a shock, because it has been optimized in the stable environment to extract the maximum return from the current conditions, and that optimization has stripped out every buffer, every alternative, every margin of safety as inefficiency. And critically, the fragile position is built on a model of the world that assumes continuity, that assumes the conditions of the recent past will persist into the future. And this assumption is embedded so deeply that it is not experienced as an assumption at all, but as simply the way things are. And here is the genuinely dangerous thing about fragility, the thing that makes it so difficult to escape. In stable times, fragility does not look like weakness. It very often looks like success. The person who has optimized completely for the current conditions, who has stripped out every buffer and concentrated everything into the single most productive channel, often outperforms the person who has kept reserves and maintained optionality and hedged against change. Because in the stable environment, the reserves and the options and the hedges are pure cost, drag, inefficiency, and the fully optimized fragile position captures more of the available return. The fragile person looks more successful, more focused, more efficient, right up until the conditions change. And then, all at once, the fragility that looked like success reveals itself as exposure, and the single dependency that provided the concentrated return becomes the single point of failure that produces the ruin. The principles that determine who is structured to survive a period of rapid change and who is structured to break under it. The difference between a fragile position and a resilient one are worth studying deliberately and as a connected whole rather than as scattered pieces of advice. And there is a body of work that lays them out carefully called the Naval Codex. It is not a set of tactics, and it is not a survival guide in any dramatic sense. It is a systematic account of the underlying principles that determine who builds and preserves a genuinely durable position, one that survives the transitions that ruin the fragile. If you want to engage with those principles directly, it is linked in the description, and there's a code on the screen you can scan to reach it. And engaging with the principles directly is what matters, because the principles of resilience hold across every particular kind of change, and the particular changes of the coming decade will arrive in forms that no one can predict precisely. Now let me describe the opposite profile, the structure of the position that survives, because this is the more important half and because it is so frequently misunderstood. The survivor is not, as people tend to assume, the wealthiest or the smartest or the most talented. Wealth helps and intelligence helps, but neither is the determining factor. And the graveyards of every previous transition are full of the wealthy and the intelligent who were fragile, who had optimized completely for conditions that ended, and who were ruined despite their resources because their position was structured for a world that no longer existed. The determining factor is not the magnitude of resources, but the structure of the position. And the structure that survives has a specific and describable shape. The survivor has optionality, genuine alternatives across the important dimensions of their life, so that no single change forecloses their future. They have ownership rather than dependence, a stake in things that they control rather than a total reliance on things controlled by others. They have an updatable model of the world, held loosely enough that new evidence can change it rather than a fixed model that assumes continuity. They have reserves and slack buffers that look like inefficiency in the stable environment, but that provide the capacity to absorb a shock without being destroyed by it. They have specific knowledge that transfers across conditions, a genuine and deep capability that remains valuable even as the specific circumstances change, rather than a narrow skill tied to a single vanishing context. And they have multiple sources of value with genuinely different drivers so that a shock to one does not take down all of them at once, because the sources do not all move together. The survivor, in short, is structured so that no single shock is fatal, so that change can be absorbed and adapted to rather than suffered as catastrophe. And this structure, which looked like wasteful overcaution in the stable years, reveals itself as the very thing that determines survival when the change arrives. I want to dwell on the monetary dimension of ruin because the most common form of ruin in the coming decade is very likely to be not the dramatic kind, but the slow kind. And it falls on a specific and enormous population that does not perceive itself to be at risk at all. We live within a debt-based monetary system in which the supply of money expands over time, flowing first into assets while wages and cash savings lag and erode. And the person whose wealth is concentrated entirely in the eroding currency, in cash and in wages, is being ruined slowly, continuously, imperceptibly, their real purchasing power flowing away year after year. And they experience this not as ruin because it is gradual and it is denominated in the very unit that hides it, but as a vague and unexplained sense that things are harder than they should be. This is fragility of the most common and most invisible kind, total concentration in a single monetary claim that is being quietly eroded. And it is a form of ruin precisely because it is slow enough and quiet enough that the person never repositions, never diversifies away from the concentration, and simply absorbs the continuous erosion year after year until the accumulated loss over the decade is enormous. The way capital actually moves during a monetary erosion of this kind, where it flows and why, and what happens to those concentrated in the eroding currency versus those who diversified into assets independent of it, is worth understanding in its specific mechanics rather than in vague outline. And there is a framework that traces exactly this, called the dragon pivot. Despite the name, it is not really about any single country. It is about how monetary transitions unfold across history, what they do to the fragile who are concentrated in the eroding currency, and how those who understood the dynamic early diversified into resilience before the slow ruin took its full toll. It is reachable through the code shown on the screen or through the link in the description for anyone who wants the fuller picture. And the fuller picture matters here because the slow monetary ruin is the form of fragility that catches the most people precisely because it is the one they least perceive as a risk. This brings me to the question of what the survivor actually owns, because resilience is not merely a matter of avoiding fatal dependencies. It is also a matter of holding the right kind of thing. And here, the distinction is between assets whose value is grounded in genuine productive capability and assets whose value is a fragile claim on a system that may be disrupted. The survivor holds genuine productive assets, equity in enterprises that create real value, intellectual property that generates real returns from real usefulness, ownership of things, whose worth is grounded in real economic activity and is therefore resilient across the monetary and technological disruptions that ruin purely financial claims. These are the assets that survive a transition because their value is grounded in something real, something productive, something that continues to generate value regardless of the specific conditions of the monetary system or the specific state of the market. The fragile position holds paper claims disconnected from real production, speculation dressed up as investment, assets whose value depends entirely on the continuation of the conditions that are ending, and these are precisely the holdings that are ruined when the conditions change. The work of distinguishing genuinely productive assets, resilient across conditions, from mere financial claims that break when conditions change, and of building a position grounded in the former rather than the latter, is worth doing systematically, and there is a framework devoted precisely to that, called the Sovereign Vault. It is concerned with building durable, generationally significant wealth grounded in real productive assets and real institutional protection, the kind of wealth that survives a transition rather than being ruined by it, rather than in the financial engineering that looks like wealth in favorable conditions and dissolves in a shock. You will find it linked below, and the code on the screen will take you straight to it for anyone who wants to go deeper on the question of what the resilient position actually holds. And that question is central, because avoiding fatal dependencies is only half of resilience, and holding genuinely durable assets is the other half. I want to address the role of artificial intelligence in all of this, because it is the single largest source of the rapid change that makes the coming decades so consequential, and because it illustrates the distinction between fragility and resilience with particular clarity. Artificial intelligence is a force of rapid change, precisely of the kind that ruins the fragile and rewards the resilient. The person whose entire economic value rests on a single skill, a narrow cognitive capability that artificial intelligence can now perform, is fragile in exactly the way that gets ruined, because their single dependency is precisely the thing being commoditized, and they have no alternative, no optionality, no other source of value to fall back on when their one skill loses its market value. And the person who has genuine specific knowledge that the technology amplifies rather than replaces, who owns productive assets rather than merely selling a single skill, who has maintained optionality and multiple sources of value, is resilient, and not only survives the change, but very often benefits from it. Because the same technology that ruins the fragile amplifies the resilient. Artificial intelligence, in other words, is the accelerant that turns the latent fragility of narrow dependence into active ruin, and that simultaneously rewards the resilience of those who built genuine depth and genuine optionality and genuine ownership before the change arrived. Which brings me to what I think is the single most important survival trait of all, the master trait beneath the others, and that is optionality, the possession of genuine alternatives, developed in advance before they are needed. Because the deep principle of optionality is that it is most cheaply acquired in advance and most expensively acquired under duress, and this principle is the whole difference between the survivor and the ruined. The survivor built their optionality, their alternatives, their reserves, their multiple sources of value during the stable years when it looked like unnecessary caution, when the fully optimized fragile position was outperforming them, when there was no visible reason to maintain the buffers and the alternatives except the abstract understanding that change eventually comes. And because they built it in advance, when it was cheap, they have it when the change arrives, and they can use it to adapt, to reposition, to absorb the shock and survive. The ruined developed no optionality because in the stable years it looked wasteful. And so they arrive at the moment of change with a single fragile position and no alternatives. And by the time they perceive the need for optionality, it is too late to build it cheaply because the change is already underway, and optionality acquired under duress is expensive and often unavailable. Optionality is the antidote to ruin, and it must be built before it is needed, which is precisely why so few people build it because building it in advance requires acting on an abstract understanding of future change rather than on the concrete pressure of a present crisis. And this points to the psychological heart of the whole matter, to the reason that most people are fragile and will remain fragile even when the logic of resilience is explained to them clearly, because understanding the reason is the only real defense against it. The first reason is that fragility is comfortable and in stable times rewarded. The fully optimized fragile position feels like success, produces the concentrated return, outperforms the resilient position, and the person occupying it has every immediate incentive to continue occupying it and no immediate incentive to sacrifice return for a resilience whose value is entirely contingent on a change that has not yet arrived. The second reason is that preparing for change that has not arrived is genuinely difficult psychologically, because it requires acting on an abstraction, on a model of a future that contradicts the evidence of the stable present, and the human mind weights the concrete present far more heavily than the abstract future. And so the reserves and the optionality and the resilience that a clear model of the future would demand are continuously overridden by the concrete experience of a present that appears stable and that rewards fragility. And the third reason, the deepest, is that resilience looks like inefficiency, like waste, like overcaution, right up until the moment it looks like foresight. And there is no way from inside the stable period to distinguish the prudent resilience that will prove to be foresight from the mere timidity that will prove to have sacrificed return for nothing. And this genuine uncertainty, this inability to know in advance whether the change will come in time to justify the resilience, is what allows the person to rationalize their fragility as reasonable optimization, right up until the change arrives and the rationalization is revealed as the thing that produced the ruin. I want to be very clear about what I am not saying, because the misreadings of this are dangerous and I want to foreclose them. I am not telling you to panic, to hoard, to retreat from the world in fear, to withdraw from all risk and all ambition into a defensive crouch. That would be to misunderstand resilience entirely, because resilience is not fearful retreat, and the survivor is not the most frightened person, but the most calmly structured one. Resilience is compatible with ambition, with risk-taking, with full engagement in the world. What it requires is not the avoidance of all risk, but the avoidance of ruinous risk. Not the elimination of exposure, but the elimination of fatal dependency. Not retreat, but structure. The calm, deliberate arrangement of one's life so that no single shock can end the game, so that change can be absorbed and adapted to rather than suffered as catastrophe. The survivor takes risks, but not risks of ruin. The survivor is exposed to the upside of change through optionality and ownership and genuine capability, while being protected from its capacity to destroy through the absence of fatal dependency and the presence of reserves and alternatives. This is not fear. It is the opposite of fear. It is the calm confidence of someone who has structured their life so that they do not need to fear the change that is coming, because they have arranged to survive and even to benefit from it. So I want to end, as I always do, not with an exhortation, but with an invitation to see clearly, because this is, in the end, one of the oldest pieces of wisdom there is, understood by every tradition and every discipline that ever took seriously the question of how to endure through uncertainty. Avoid ruin above all, because ruin is the one loss you cannot recover from. Build resilience in advance, because it is cheap before it is needed and unavailable after. Maintain optionality, avoid fatal dependency, own rather than depend, hold genuine productive assets, keep your model of the world updatable, and structure your life so that no single shock can end the game. This is not new. It is the oldest logic of survival through uncertainty, and it has always distinguished those who endure from those who are ruined. What is new is only the circumstance, the particular convergence of technological and monetary and structural change that makes the coming decade a period of elevated volatility, a period in which the accumulated fragility of a long, stable era meets the rapid change that turns fragility into ruin. Who survives? is not decided in the moment of crisis. It is decided in the years of quiet structuring that precede it, in the choices made when the environment still appears stable and fragility still appears successful, to build the optionality and the reserves and the ownership and the genuine capability that resilience requires. The fragile look successful, right, up until the change arrives, and then all at once, they don't. The resilient look overcautious, right up until the change arrives, and then all at once, they are the ones still standing. And the whole of it, the fragility and the resilience alike, remains invisible in its consequences for a long time, the way these things always do, through the long, stable stretch in which the difference does not yet show, and then reveals itself the way ruin and survival always reveal themselves, which is slowly, imperceptibly, in the quiet accumulation of exposure or of resilience that no one notices. And then suddenly, at the moment, the change finally arrives and the ground shifts and the fragile positions break all at once, while the resilient positions, structured long before for exactly this, are found to have been all along the ones that were going to survive.